Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're here with episode 48 of the Ready Set Shag podcast. We're cruising right along, talking to a lot of great people. If it's your first time here, first time listening, this podcast features people that I really enjoy. I really enjoy their commentary. A lot of times, I like them as people. Some of them are my friends. Other people I just want to get to know, or even people who are of opposing viewpoints. I like to try and get a taste of everyone. Yeah. Anyways, thank you all for joining us live. Those who are lurking, those who are joining us after the fact, I really appreciate it. But again, my guest this week, someone who I've admired, watched from afar, catch their shows when I can. I'm in a weird time zone. The mountain time zone's weird. I was in Hawaii for a while, then I moved to the mainland, and I feel like I'm lost in the mountains as well now too. It's strange, but either way, I'm really happy to have Andreas Xirtus with me today, sir. How you doing? You're muted though.
That's probably for the best. I really like the picture you chose of me, because that's from I was in Denmark at this. I was running this project called the Universal Standard Community, or I was doing designs for the Universal Standard Community project,
Oh,
and I have that fanny pack that I'm wearing in the picture
nice.
right there, and it has my little speaker on it, and so I'm a big fan of my fanny pack because it has like rocks in it and headphones and piece of moldavite, you know what I mean? Like I got
Right.
things going on in there.
Gotta
But
have that.
got earplugs, got a little labradorite and the little case of earplugs in there. But
Awesome.
what's cool with it was the speaker, because with the speaker what I would do is I would walk around Denmark, and they're really chill people in Denmark, you know what I mean? Like they're pretty calm. And
Yeah.
I'm a little bit of a spaz. So I'll have that speaker and I'll just blast. It'd be like a gray day, and they're just like in their apartments trying to be quiet, and all of a sudden it's just like open source techno music from Binar Pilot like everywhere. And it's just like really, and if you get two of those tri-bit speakers, you can you can blast it.
Mhm.
So it was pretty exciting. I miss kind of ruining like the day, because they're like, oh, what kind of a Southern German is here in our town, and he's blasting this Darude sandstorm at us. It was like, it's pretty fun. I like doing that.
Nice, dude. A man of the world. Well, for those who don't know who you are and who are, hearing your voice for this first time or learning of you for the first time, hard to believe. But
That's cool to hear, I guess, these days. Yeah.
give us a rundown of who you are, like kind of what brought you into the internet and like what you kind of do on a day to day.
So I'm from the internet. So I'm a weird guy for sure. Like, first thing off the bat, easy to understand about me. But when people used to ask me like where I'm from, because I travel around the world, I'd say I'm from the internet, because I grew up in Santa Cruz, California, in Silicon Valley's kind of like beach, like if kind of place. And I grew up with a lot of internet I grew up in a pile of Ethernet cables. So I was always in the internet, and I had I had access to T3 internet, not at my house, but I could go into town and use T3 internet at my dad's office in
Yeah.
like in the mid 90s. And so I had like internet that was quite a bit ahead of most internet for a while. And so people will say that the future is already here. It's just not equally distributed yet. So I've always kind of felt like I'm from the future, and I'll go to a town and they'll be playing a rerun of a show I've seen before. And I'm like, I've seen this one, and I'm Marty McFly. And that happens so often because shows will change the course of you go to Argentina and you see how they brought in Monsanto, and you're like, oh, I've seen this one. I see how the birth defects are going to come or whatever, right? So I've been
Yeah.
through a lot of that loop. But I used to be kind of straight laced. I worked for CNN. I was worried that working in media would be like a bad idea. So I continued with an engineering degree. So while I was working for Social Media Strat and doing things first for Flipboard, who got purchased by Turner and then turned into the original CNN system, on CNN.com. So I did like their social media strat
Yep.
for a number of years. But simultaneously, I was working towards my engineering degree and did nanotechnology. So I'm also a nerd, and I like graphene. And Ian Crossland from Timcast, we've been friends for years. We've been friends since 2008 or 9 or something like that in LA. lived in the same house in Venice Beach. He lived in the front house and in the back house, which is the house that the Doors used to live in, Jim Morrison and Ray Manzarek. So have a cool backstory there. Yeah. So we were into music and art, and between Ian and I, our friend Judd won Survivor, and that was really exciting because then we got to like go in limousines, and I could project video at the House of Blues and things like that. And so I was thrown into like this media world really early on. And so for the long time, I was always behind the camera or doing like editing or things like that. There's like scenes of me like on TL, what's it called? TCM or TMZ. TMZ, there's like videos in like 2008, 2009, 2010 and things like that where I'm like with Judd or with somebody or something like that. But that was all just sort of like while I was trying to work towards my engineering degree. And simultaneously I was working towards I was doing stoichiometric indexing, which is where you measure what parts of which materials make up this bond or this molecule or this composite material. So doing material science indexing, like, and you look at these different materials with a scanning electron microscope, right? So I was doing a lot of that, and I was getting into media more. And then while I was working for CNN, Flight 370 happened, and Flight 370 was a really weird, like, fun week, you know, because I got really interested in. I was already thinking like I don't watch TV. It's weird they want me to work for CNN. They want me to help them do their web stuff. I guess it's to help them kind of navigate to the internet where people are at, you know. But that wasn't what they wanted at all. They really wanted to navigate the internet back to TV. And they weren't understanding that wasn't going to happen. And they were super freaked out because they realized that Turner, who used to own 60% of television stations, go on the TV, it's like Turner, Cartoon Network owned by Turner, you know, CNN and Turner. All of a sudden it was like the internet. There's billions of people and they're all a channel. And this is like prototypical, but YouTube was even more free back then. So there was even cooler media. So they were freaked out. How are they going to compete with that? And it was interesting because, like, you know, the YouTube creators, like Ian was really getting into YouTube at the very beginning stages, like make a YouTube video every day. And Ian made YouTube videos every single day and doing it like in LA in 2008 to 12 or something like that. He's super early on, was doing vlogs, and he got really popular that way, but also connected with the creators studio. And the creator studio, if you follow that lore, it's like the Disney studio that CNN kind of created in order to get control of content creators, and all of those first gen, not really first gen, like third gen YouTube creators happened through the content creator studio. And I got to see how YouTube was a controlled market again through the same people that were like, okay, we're going to carve up this and make it so that only our shows are on the top of that. And, you know, I never thought I'd do YouTube videos myself, really. So I ended up doing a social project for the Peruvian government with Ian down in South America. And we had some serious problems with the government of Peru, like the president of Peru, Alan Garcia, who was cool, but he ended up suicided and we had to leave the country. There's a lot more to that. But once we got out to Chile and stuff, I was like, I got to be really careful now, you know? So I thought I'll put out some videos about some of the things I've seen in South America. And that was like the beginning of my YouTubing. And I just sort of like continued to YouTube from there. I also was doing some videos about all of the different lost history, because I was like, well, this isn't what's really going on here. I've been to that place and it looks like this. And this is what the people say about that. And this is what really doesn't add up with the Wikipedia page. And it really evolved because it got to a point where people were talking about, hey, Atlantis, hidden history, maybe there's a lost civilization, maybe there's an erasure of culture, of society. What is Tartaria? And I'd heard of Tartaria all my life because as a Croatian American, Tartars are really like, they're the Cossacks. They're an important historical group. And there's movies like Taurus Bulba that I'd seen as a kid. And apparently it was more rare than I'd thought. And I'd been to Croatia, I'd been all over former Balkanized Yugoslavia multiple times. And I could see the connections also of how these cultures were not the way they'd been told to be erased. And it's like, here's what happened here. Here's what my family said happened in here. Here's what my Spanish family have as records in Valencia going back 500 years. Because luckily my mom's family is Spanish, have records. They keep journals going back. And I've also found the history you keep in your journals that contradicts that of the news and the history that you have, right? And they'll often say, oh, they just didn't really understand what was really going on. But more likely, fake news becomes fake history, and
Right.
people just keep believing it, right? And I'd seen that from CNN. I was like, whoa, 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 I've seen how they do this. So wait, are you telling me that this story from 1960 is a lie? Probably. And then 1860 is a lie. And then like looking at news from 1812 all of a sudden. I'm like, wait, look at this. This is not true. This is not true. This is what's really going on. Here's the astronomical record of the Napoleon comet, right? There's a whole thing about a comet that rains in 1812. We know the War of 1812, but we don't talk about how there's earthquakes, the Mississippi River flowing backwards, that there's 260 days where the sky is filled with comets like behind me right now, freaking people out. That, and there's a group of people, hundreds of thousands of people apparently around the world that were put into mental asylums because they believed in something called, they had what doctors described as Napoleon Comet Syndrome, where they believed that the comet somehow had affected the course of the change of history of the world, the new governments that had taken over, that Napoleon had winning, that the burning of Moscow, the erasure of the old country, right? And we hear that a lot, the old country,
Yeah.
right? So that got me really interested in revisionist history, and I think that's how people know me.
Yeah, dude, that's the thing. I could probably listen to you. I could probably just tell you, go off on something, Andreas, and then I'll just listen to you this whole time.
I laugh when I hear that because I do rant and I feel bad. I'm like, I should stop that. Like,
I enjoy it because half of my like TikTok feed is like conspiracy, quote unquote conspiracy theories on what could have happened, like what the solar system looked like, ancient Egypt, all this stuff, Easter Island, all kinds of different things. And I'm fascinated by it because, and even in my own works, like I'm working on writing a story that plays with the idea of multiple civilizations like layered on each other, like where there's no possible way we could know like what civilization we are. Like we think we're the first one, but like I sit here and I'm like, if we're saying we have 6 trillion years or 6 billion years like of natural history in the universe, like you're telling me we're only here for 2, 3, 4,000 or not 4,000, like 35,000 years, give or take. Like there's got to be way more than that.
Yeah,
and obviously
crazy. And we've changed so much too. Like you start to look at like the records of how humans write. There's a philosopher, Havelock, who talks about how there's uplifting. So we might have written stories and told stories a certain way until like Greek mythology, and then Greek mythology at very least is a benchmark where we have these kinds of thoughts we didn't have before, and maybe it even infers that our brains have changed, And so the idea of wet wire programming and evolution, the idea of multiple root races, I think also is one. Like, and it's interesting when you say things like conspiracy theory, and you even have to put your fingers up because you're like, this isn't exactly the word I mean for what I'm saying.
right.
You know what I mean? And I agree with you. I think that what it is that the conspiracy theory is what we've been taught. And I know that sounds cliche, but it seems pretty clear that there's a conspiracy that is, I'm not just talking about McGraw-Hill or, Herbert Walker Bush, but there is this sort of conspiracy of a group of people that have benefited. Maybe we're talking about Standard Oil, maybe not. There are people that are benefited by a placated populace that have a way of understanding things. And we could have different metaphors. 2 + 2 = 5. There's different ways to look at it. Yeah. But that seems like the conspiracy. What you're telling me is like alternatives. You're looking for alternatives that explain the anomalies, right? And that's what's weird. There's so many anomalies and we just sort of deal with it. And we say, well, just you don't need to understand it all the way.
Right.
But the more you look at the anomalies, they start to add up. And how many anomalies does it take before you say, this isn't, the way I was taught? That might be a conspiracy, actually, because they really benefit from me believing that this other information might be a synchromistic coincidence. It might not be that it's planned. It might not be that it's a conspiracy. It might just be that there's so many things that add up together, and that used to be illegal. You couldn't think that way. 20 years ago, they started saying that stereotyping was wrong. Now we have AI that does all the stereotyping for us. Right?
It's funny, isn't it?
It's really good at it. And we're like,
I
wow,
heard
we're really bad at this. I don't know.
Yeah, I heard you say that the other day, and I'm like, wow, he's so like it's spot on. Like that's all it does.
But people think that AI, it's like, wow, I can't remember phone numbers. I remember remembering 20, 30, 40, 50 of my friends' phone numbers at a time, forgetting them, remembering their new ones all the time. So the idea that your memory palace can't compete with AI. Granted, I'm a huge AI guy. I'm just saying it's not that this is not a situation where humans can't compete. We could do these things. We are eventually, AI should be a system that's installed in a human body because that's the best system for it. That's what NVIDIA is working towards, is a bioelectrical that can run this thought type. And that's what freaks people out a lot, I think, in the future, is this idea of like education. Because education I think of as artificial intelligence. If we write books, teach kids how to think that way, they're not naturally coming up with that. That's a synthetic learning system. So we get to a point where we say, okay, how safe is a transhumanist education? I mean, we look at universities now and people are freaked out at what they're doing. They're doing crazy things that are defying the biological imperatives. And so you have to wonder, I think AI is something like that as well. We might get to a point where we say the idea of identity, the idea of privacy, that we can get rid of those just because we could stack memories. We could stack memories and make up what persons are and kill people, right?
Do you think we're reaching like the top of the bell curve though of our capabilities and like
no. So I think it's like, we think of like ladders, right? And it used to be that you climb a ladder and someone helps you get up the ladder, and then they get a little higher, and there's trickle down economics. It's like there used to be multiple levels to the curve. There was the lower middle class, the upper middle class, all these things. And what you have now is you have this is not the first time. You have the collapse of that through hyper risk investments. So you have an investment in the risk takers by the conservatives. Someone who can, a conservatorship, let's say there's a gold rush in California.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than me doing it, if I'm, an East Coastie, I might put money into 100 guys, and rather than get the best guy, I might just get the 100 cheapest guys because they're the same price as getting the best guy. And my probability of success are higher that way, and pay them all a tenth of what I was going to pay, or, 1% of what I was going to pay this other guy. Right. So that ends up being the method. And then you get these psychopaths. So the psychopaths who will kill, cheat, steal will make it in a system like that. They'll climb the ladder and then they'll kick the ladder out from underneath them, And so I think that's really, I don't think that we've hit the capacity both economically, ideologically, intellectually. I think that we're actually maybe about to reach a point that we've already hit several times before, where we have an educated populace. But the places that we, again, the future's already here, it's not equally distributed. The place with the most equally distributed futures are places like Cuba. People think of Cuba as the backwaters of the earth because it's, it's like an Amish Latino settlement, right? It's a communist thing where they're not allowed to have futuristic technology, but really they're just isolated from will and grace, right?
Okay.
So there might be a circumstance very soon where, you look at Paraguay in the 17th century before the Triple Alliance, where a 99% literacy rating. We might get to a point like that where the entire populace is educated and that each one has facilitated potential. And I don't think that we've reached that point yet. I don't think it's fair to say that we've hit that benchmark.
Does a 99% educated populace, does that create like peace? Is that where we reach a point where we can live in harmony, or does that become the tipping point where we essentially destroy ourselves?
I'm not a huge peace guy. Mm-hmm. And I'm more of a discord or chaos guy. Like some people might call me an accelerationist. I think what it is, I'm not saying I identify as that, but it's more that humanity isn't supposed to reach peace unless that's a consequence after reaching justice. So to me, justice is so much more important than peace. I think that a lot of the time people will stop and argue. Like, let's say a couple before bed. Do you finish like your argument, or do you just concede and build up because you'd rather have peace? And I think peace is a dangerous thing in a lot of ways. We might reach a point of order through justice,
Okay.
And I think a consequence of order is a sort of peace, but there's just so many sorts of peace. So it's not something worth making your primary goal. Like, I'm not Miss America. But I do think that justice and order are things that we could reach through discourse. And the main difference, like, so some people are centrists. You have this idea of a tug of war between the left and the right, and they're pulling, and a consensus is a secession. You concede your point, he concedes their point, or they do, and eventually you end up at the point where everyone's lost completely. They're just stuck in the center. No one has any more values. They've surrendered their values. I'm not a big fan of centrism. I prefer heterodoxy. I think that if you look at a heterodoxy, you have the extreme right and the extreme left, and those are much more Pac-Man. They both connect. The centrists are too like each other because they've given up on who they are. Yet those who become themselves, right? The extreme communists and the extreme libertarian conservative Republicans both have semi-automatic weapons. They both love gardening. They both want families, right? So to me, it's more about uniting the extremes than it is about losing the things that make you extreme.
That's an interesting approach to it. I never really thought of it like that. Because right now it seems like the extremes are tearing themselves apart rather than like
that to me is centrism. But you don't think so? Wait, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, no, I was just going to say it seems like the extreme left and extreme right have not identified the fact that they are very similar, like in nature.
Totally.
And because except
for the DNC and the GOP, like at the top, I think it's like, what's that movie about prison football? You know what I mean?
Oh, The Longest Yard.
Longest Yard. It's the longest yard. You know what I mean? It takes a while for the prisoners to realize, and if they do, they get removed from the system, right?
Right.
The game is owned by the game masters.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's see, this is why I like you, because you think it's all outside of the box, right? And it's part of the problem when you start looking at things, alternative histories and stuff, like, because you're put inside the box, like, you know, public schools, whatever, they're like, this is where you live, and if you go outside of that, we don't like it, and we're gonna shame you and other you and all that stuff. And like I said, you can't even discuss this stuff in a way that
and they teach you that you chose it. They're like, well, you are your ancestors, and your ancestors chose to do this. They built America, and it's supposed to be this way.
Yeah.
And it's for you, right? Yeah.
So yeah, it's been the whole journey of looking at all this stuff. And again, I have this fascination with ancient history, though I don't know a whole lot about it. The more I look at it, the more I'm like, I totally get down with all these theories of, you know, like, let's look into Atlantis. Let's look into civilizations that built Egypt far before they were even there. You
totally.
know?
And like, I think you're benefited by not knowing all of it. So a lot of the time, I mean, this is something that a lot of the audience might think like, oh, wow, Andreas went super woke leftist for a second. But there's something wrong with Eurocentricity. It's not an impossibility that both are true, that like the 1619 project isn't true, but that the Eurocentric, Oxfordian, Smithsonian educated history that British people believe has problems, right? There's a reason why there's an argument. Right. And like the idea that the English people are this evolved state, this peak apex of humanity, we kind of subconsciously, maybe if we were conscious, we knew that's not true, but subconsciously people accept that because they were taught that in school, the same as the American thing. And that comes from the World War II interaction with the Germans who were studying in Africa. Of course, there were Brits in Africa and South Africa. There were Germans in West Africa, the Afrikaners with the Dutch. And they found, of course, in Germany, the Neanders Valley. And so Neanders Valley, the Neanderthal thing, and that was German, and the British had to have their own, right? So they find the what's it called again? I'm sorry, the fake British hill man. What's it called?
Fuck. I know what you're talking about, and I can't think of the name.
Human, the Piltdown man. Okay, yeah. So the Piltdown man. So they put some chimpanzee teeth and some pig teeth into a skull, and they say, no. Germans didn't find. We did. We found the origin point, and that threw off history for a long time, because anytime someone in Africa were saying, really, humans evolved in England, But we have evidence that otherwise. They'd be like, well, you're in Africa. You know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about. It doesn't matter if you're white or black. You're in Africa, right? You're not in England and you're not part of this English school. So we have this tradition of believing we've hit this apex, that the British Pax Britannica culture, this new world order, is the apex point, and that anything that came before it is just on the way here. We can't handle this idea of reality. Look, any story has rising and falling. You have an escalation and you have de-escalation, right? The decline. You have an incline and decline. So it's not reasonable to say that we're the apex point. And it's actually strange. We have these pictures of it. Even the smartest of us, like the meme where the humans evolving devolve back into a guy bent over again because he's using a computer, right?
Yep.
So we know, like, it just is. There's waves that happen. Terence McKenna talked about time wave theory. This idea that we're going through waves. Astronomers and weather meteorologists will talk about waves. We talked, I think, at one point about El Nino. El Nino, I don't know if we said it here, but El Nino is an interesting cycle. If we look at storms and how storms happen, how they environmentally affect us, right? Cycles and waves will affect everything about flourishing agriculture, the wine that we're able to ferment and drink, the cultures that are produced on it. These are crazy. It's crazy how much our environment can affect us and how cyclical it is.
Yeah, dude. I actually saw, there's a documentary on Netflix called Neanderthals, and it's just another fascinating look at how old, like, not so much humans, obviously Neanderthals aren't what we were, but still, like,
we're a lot closer related to Neanderthals than we like to admit. The British don't like to talk about it, but again, Europeans can be up to like 5% Neanderthal. So it's not that we're a different species. That's something that's only in the last 12 years accepted science. It was like 60 years ago people were saying this, probably longer, but I wasn't able to research it. But they're saying it for a long time. But Germans, they weren't allowed to push these theories. And so the British would say, well, what's up with these Cro-Magnons or these Neanderthals or the Denisovan, those dirty Slavic Denisovan, right? They must have had bigger heads because they were thicker skulled idiots.
Yeah.
That's what it was. They were idiots. That's literally the scientific record is British people telling everyone that they're inferior idiots. And Neanderthal were clearly brilliant, strong. The main issue was that they had an environmental disaster, which, if you were trying to survive for 20,000 years or however long after a volcano destroyed and created some sort of an ice age, you might not be painting. You know what I mean? You might be busy trying to make flints to survive. And they did a good job, I think.
Yeah, that was like what I was sort of taking away, or from this whole thing was just, I agree with you in that there's truth on everything, and be it the 1619 project, whatever. Like,
yeah, honestly, like, that's a thing that people should look into more. The idea that, I mean, granted, there's some serious issues with that, but we should rebuild history. We should probably work together to rebuild history.
No, and again, the Eurocentrism part of it is like we're starting like, hey, we're the apex because we control the drug trade, through
immediately, not always, but immediately. Exactly.
So like it's one of those things that I actually saw this really cool thing on how Europe like basically came to take over Indochina and all that areas because they were basically running drugs and because of all that money, like they were able to,
human trafficking, drug running, and they were realizing they needed a drug run because they were addicted to tea. Right. So they're like, we're spending so much money on tea. What can we do about that? Can we hook them on opium? Like, I mean, we've done it before. Like, this is what blows my mind about the Brits, right?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a really cool. I mean, it's really cool. It's like when you learn about this stuff and you start bringing it up to people, they're like, "What are you talking about, bro? Like, that didn't fucking happen." Like no, it did. And
dude, Hong Kong. They bombed. They had boats sieging Hong Kong because at a certain point, China said, "Look, we don't want to let any more of your opium in. It's killing people and it's doing weird stuff to people." And in Britain's like, "No, you can't stop us from selling this stuff." And they started bombing them. They started shooting cannonballs at them until they're like, "Oh my god!" And they like in order to force them. And there are letters like from the emperor like, this is, I've read that this is illegal in your country. Why are you selling it here?
Right. Yeah, it all became like super fascinating. I never really, I guess I always had like some interest in history. My dad, he used to watch History Channel all the time, like World War II stuff, and that was always like really cool. And but like as I got a little bit older and was like out of college and everything, I just started looking at it a little bit differently, and I just became interested in things, not even, again, not recent history, but just the ancient part of it, because there were so many questions like what, where, why, like were these previous civilizations like us? Like, did they have technology that we have, or
all it takes for something to be ancient is for us to no longer be able to read it, right? So we think of unrecorded as ancient, but really there are tons of examples of modern history that are ancient now, because all it takes is like the Soviet Union. A lot of history, a lot of medical records are now ancient records because they've been erased and we don't have access to them, right? So
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine, but like the Back to the Future movie again, right? Hill Valley, we don't know what happened after the flood. That's a major part of the movie, is that there's the records are lost after the flood.
Right.
How many floods are there in the United States? Missouri, California, Sacramento, Galveston, Texas. Galveston, Texas is one of the gnarliest ones. Utah has some major floods too. You have towns that are lost. Now, what's lost in a town? The births and death records of everyone who's ever lived in that town, the newspapers that were in that town. And so we don't really think about it, but there are hundreds of years of ancient history lost in the last 200 years. You know, the forbidden frontier, the Wild West, that was all these things that are gone. And there are some that are saved still. Like, and this is another thing, like when we think about unocculting of records. So the Druidic records are controlled by the Vatican Library. And a lot of people think of the Druids as the ancient Druids, which is it's mostly true, but it's not. They're the classified Druids. Because the Vatican have the books, they have the records, they know what they did, right? Yeah. So you can so this is the thing, there's always going to be a class of people that have access to this information. And that, again, with this idea the future's already here, it's not equally distributed. So many people are living in a world where, I mean, you and I grew up in a really more educated time, because with the rapidity of media and VHS that we could see reruns of things. You've probably seen movies from times before you were born and felt them in ways that were like you were there. Right. And you have an empathy that's almost psychic for some of these historical moments, right? Mm. And that's a miraculous, beautiful thing not everyone can have, but it's been built in. Look at kids born after 2012, that there's just so much freaking media, and they can't watch a 24 frame per second movie, let alone... Right? So they're not going to see history the same way. It's interesting how easy it is for history to be lost. Because the thing about that is then you repeat it so easily, because you can entrap somebody in this is how they do it. They lay out a table with Lego figurines like Prussians, and they say, if you're in this situation, this will happen. If that happens, you'll do this. If this happens, then that will happen. And they can create chains of reactions that if you don't know how to get out of, you'll repeat history, right?
Yeah, that's one of the issues I have with modern media consumption and even like news cycles, is how like they're forced and like perpetuated by short form like content. So something awful happens at a school, right? Like a school shooting or whatever, stabbing, whatever it might be. And then they take that event and whatever footage they might have, and they loop it and they blast it out on Twitter, on Instagram, and that becomes the thing. And they make it as, and that's an awful thing. No one's defending it or saying it.
Live on CNN, Nancy Kerrigan, 3:00 in the morning. Nancy Kerrigan. I don't know if you remember the Desert Storm Nancy Kerrigan thing.
I do.
That was, I actually had so when I was a kid, I had East German exchange student. So he was right after the wall came down, and he came through the Rotary Club to California. He just visited this summer with his wife and his children, and his wife's there from East Germany. And we're talking about media and things like that. And, they used to be kind of more skeptical of me until like COVID hit Germany. But now I'm talking about think about how in the CNN, the first media blitz was the Desert Storm War.
Yep.
And they had 24-hour satellite media. Before that, it was like TV turned off at night, and you had like the American flag. And after that, you needed something after Desert Storm. So Nancy Kerrigan. And Nancy Kerrigan's this total nonsense story that's not even really real. Like some
Right.
other person who didn't even know her, who was abusive of her through her mother, went and did this thing and had her life destroyed. But the whole thing was done 24 hours a day as a media blitz. And they realized there's two things you can do. One is you can put everyone's attention on a thing,
Yep.
like Elvis Presley. The other thing is you can have a hidden hand. Because, let's give an example of my like mineral water bottle you can't see in this hand. There's a hidden hand here, right? And then there's there's nothing in this hand. Look there's nothing in this hand right now. And that's the media, 100%. If they can put all the, and this is so much more telescopically magnified, exponentially magnified by social media because of the meme, because of memetics, because now, and I hate to do this, but like whenever a show happens that almost every show that my friends do, it's a contemporaneous event that is being emotionally reacted to by we are the role models of people. I don't, to an extent, I'm not trying to say it like narcissistically. I just mean, why are we focusing on a contemporaneous event like that we obviously see is a psychological operation? It's obviously controlled in every way, and we're trying to process it. The only benefit might be that because most people won't have the effort or the time because they're living their lives, they're raising children, and they have jobs, that we're giving them the best process of that we can so they can let it go.
Right.
But that just seems so dangerous. And also it means that the media we have is so invariably presentist. It will not last. You can't watch an episode about something like that 4 years from now and care the same way. Whereas a conversation that's a bit more broad, I feel like we can talk about this stuff, and then in 5 years or in 100 years, people could still wonder about our perspective through that.
Mm-hmm. No, totally. And I guess the worst part is like we've trained our minds, or someone has trained our minds to be like short-lived in that. So again, you see that one event, it's played over and over for you. You move on from it. There's no real attachment to it. But then the next one that happens, let's say a year down the road, okay, now you have 2 events to play. And not only that, but you have multiple angles, right? So that becomes 4 events that are looped in your head. And then the third one happens, and then then it becomes this exponential rise when only 3 events actually happened over a 6-year period. It becomes even worse because now you're looking at multiple angles of the same thing. There's only 3 events, but yet it's an epidemic that we have to,
No, so like at CNN, we would have like, what are the most horrific stories that are going on today? And you'd be surprised because, somebody would like rip off some baby's face, like crazy things happen in the world. But some days there wouldn't be much and you'd be almost shocked. And so they're like, that's okay. That's okay. We'll bring in the shrink to talk about the thing that happened yesterday or last week or whatever it is. We'll bring up the thing that happened before. And that's the thing. When you see a news cycle where you're like, oh my God, this story is so big. No, what you're telling me is there's nothing going on.
Right.
If the same story is being talked about, there's not a lot going on. There's one story, and it's being magnified in such a way that it's actually affecting your life. And that's so scary because, you can think about all these people that were affected by the Bible or the Quran or like the Bhagavad Gita. Instead, they're being affected by CNN. That's really scary. That shouldn't be the thing, in my opinion, especially considering like the people I've known, right? But
yeah, and now I'm even seeing, because I will occasionally go onto TikTok and I'll debate people on certain topics. A lot of them recently centered around like pro-life, pro-choice, stuff like that. And the last one I did, this guy, it really scared me, the question he was asking me, because it was so obvious the answer in my head, but he wanted me to explain why it was, I forget exactly what it was. It was basically like, why is it wrong to kill a human being? And I'm like, it was like trying to explain.
Well, that's an interesting question. Did you see George Carlin's thing on life being sacred? His idea of the sanctity of life.
I probably did. And I don't remember what he said, but please remind me.
It's hard to understand. Like, it's hard to I don't completely agree with it, but the idea that like, what do you mean by life is what do you mean by the sanctity of life? Now, I believe often in the sanctity of life, but who promoted this idea first? And you have human sacrifice. you have war, you have the Spartans sacrificing people that aren't perfect. You have, and again, like, it's not just that. Like, the Aztecs will sacrifice the most perfect. So the idea of what is sacred about life, we eat life, in order to keep living. And the idea that everything is created by God, like, if this gets to a religious place, well,
Right.
God kills a lot of people. God's basically both killing people who deserve it and people who don't deserve it all the time. Like, do you thank God for curing the cancer God gave you, right? So it gets really complicated when we think about the sanctity of life. And I don't mean that just as a joke, because there are people that are clearly Death Eaters and have lived in a world of trauma, probably because they've seen a lot of death really young. They lost someone very close to them. Especially, God, if you're wealthy, and let's say you're like the peak of your game and you die, maybe you're a 45-year-old man who's lots of money and you have a heart attack, or maybe you're 90 and you've lived your whole life. There's not really a good jumping off point. If you used to have Olympic-sized swimming pools with concubines, like you used to have this, right?
Yeah.
So it's like the idea of death, it becomes, I think, an obsession to a materialist.
Yeah. It's just, no. And my response to him was kind of like, I was a little dumbfounded, because what I said basically to him, like, it's a complicated thing. Like, there's no easy way to explain it. And he couldn't accept that as an answer. And I was like, but I also, again, this was like me calling into the guy, and, he's like a raging communist leftist dude that was like, doing this live on his show too. And I was just, so I didn't have time to fully formulate it, but I was like, we could have a whole 2-hour discussion on like why it's so multifaceted and
life is freaking cool. Like,
Yeah.
at very least I think most people ought to agree on the fascination of the machination of life. It's really life is an amazing thing. The idea that you have, life is alchemical, that it produces more than it takes to create. Life is a system of memory, that it explodes in order to create signatures of phosphorance. So you could have a dynamic between, like, a binary system, a hexadecimal system between the ATCG. The DNA itself is hexadecimal binary. That DNA has sequences designed in CRISPR to predict error and to correct them. I think that if we had seen DNA this way 50, 60 years earlier, when people were first starting to open up their minds in psychedelics, atheism wouldn't exist the way we look at it now, and it's already a dying faith. Because I don't think that atheism. Yeah, I don't think atheism lasted as long as other religions. Like, Scientology will last longer. Atheism is already dead, because you have Scientologists. You already have simulation theorists, and simulation theory isn't just a theory. It's an excuse or an apologetic for atheism. But when you think about atheism, the idea of a God existing is a natural evolutionary progress that would occur, right? Like, you think about singularity, and you think about humanity becoming a singularity, and how intelligence is socialized, how atoms socialize to become intelligences, and that they record memory, and that we've built memory recording systems, and we have random access solid state memory systems. The idea that the human race is like this singularity is approaching that idea. And maybe people could say, okay, with the Drake equation, we haven't seen enough examples of other civilizations in space or something like that. Like, that might be the argument. But that then says we're a miracle, right? If you're saying that we're the only thing, then you're right back to the miracle argument. So
Right.
The best argument is we're the only one we've discovered. There's others that occur. And if that's the case, in the Drake equation, Kardashev scales, we're not even up to number one in the Kardashev scale, a totally world-sustaining... the Kardashev scale is a Soviet idea that when we reach a type 1 civilization, volcanoes will no longer destroy towns, and we'll be able to use that energy to power cars, right? We'll have complete control over all of our energy. Type 2 is controlling the sun, etc.
Okay.
If you're a type 2 or type 3 civilization, and you have the capacity not to die. You're essentially immortal. You have an akashic record that's random access. You're able to commit dreams to reality. You can realize ideas. You can 3D print, femtoprint anything into existence. You basically achieved all the attributes that were sermonized to me by evangelicals, right? You know, you've created heaven, you've created Zion, you've created immortality, you've created God. So the fact that that's a potential means that that's likely already occurred from what we already understand about astronomy. There's so many places where stars have existed. There's prototypical chance for that.
What about protecting ourselves against like EMPs? Like, where does that fall and everything? Because I feel like that's like, as far as humanity goes, it's our biggest vulnerability right now. Like, we can do all these things, but like one EMP pretty much puts us like in the ground.
So most of the Doctor Strangelove scenario for that is, again, elite. You know, you can say you look at South America and it's a pretty great place to avoid nuclear strikes because the nuclear radiation is most likely pushed up by the stratosphere, and you have a VLF band. It probably would end up at our equatorial region.
Mhm.
And particularly, there's no likelihood of, unless someone like bombs Antarctica is anomalous, where there's radiation is pushed out of it, and it's also where there's no ionosphere or ozone right there. So when meteors are falling, they're not being torn up the same as everywhere else on the world. So if you have places like outside of the EMP zone and outside of the Aurora Borealis zone that are protected and they're, you know, inside of a mountain, then you're likely to have technology that'll make it, right? And if everyone resets, that gets back into this idea of there's probably like a 2-century reset that happens every couple of centuries that
Right.
society continues to go, right?
So you're saying move to Antarctica? Is what you're saying?
Well, but also I'm really fascinated with the Mennonites. So like the Amish are only weird for the last century, right? Like if you think about it, they're pretty normal until computers and technology. And now you have Mennonites that drive trucks. So they figure out there's like a limit to what maybe they're going to use biodiesel that they can use themselves. But they've had 40, 50, 60, 100 years to see everyone else experiment before they use that technology.
Right.
And I think we could probably see something like that where you know, a solar flare is going to take out technology that's not, you know, protected.
Mhm.
But technology is there's external and internal technology. So the fork is a piece of external technology. Chopsticks are an internal idea about how to use technology. Okay. So I think that's also something when we look at resets, the idea of Atlantis, there might be multiple fleets that left, right? This is one of the Blavatsky ideas, is that if Atlantis fell and multiple people left, different groups left. One of them might have been where Hebrew and numbers, the idea of mathematics, you know, not just Hebrew, but like Proto-Arabic and mathematics and cuneiform, that all emerged as one culture. And another culture that had no access to running hardware, but only knew software, right? So someone else is really good at architecture, but they don't know how to run the software. And then they're sent off to Malta or something. Mm-hmm. And this could be really the kind of thing we see where an entire civilization that used to be a cappuccino economy separates itself and galvanizes, right?
Do you think not? I mean, I don't mean to stay on like ancient history the whole time, and I hope chat and whoever's listening enjoys it because I certainly love this kind of talk. Like, what fascinates me about looking back in the past the most, I think, and I actually spoke with Gary Nerdrotic about this a little bit, is that like from where we sit, we look back at whatever information we have. You look at these megalithic structures and you think, okay, why did they construct them? Was there some form of like remuneration that was given? Like were people paid to do this? Was it all slaves that did this? Like what? What's it called? Venice, like built on like basically mud plateaus that like, or is it Venice that I'm
right?
thinking
Yeah,
of?
A lot of the best cities are built on water because it's the highway. And you can move boats around. It's super easy. You put tons of weight on a thing. So you can see like Charlotte, like actually the Roman roads were less important than the Roman canals, right? And the canal systems that traveled things. And the United States, you can see where they have all these names of towns in the Midwest, but they were built along river paths, right? And so even during the Confederacy, like floating cotton bales was the way you did it. And a cotton bale in 1865 was worth $1,000, right?
Right.
So
Logging
river
industry
systems.
too. They
Yeah.
dump them into a river, push them down the river.
But you know about star forts, right? Have we talked about star forts before? Do you know
No.
what that is?
Nope.
So star forts are like, if you've seen in the Mario Brother game, like it's like the castle is like a big star, and if you go to Amsterdam or in Holland, Denmark, there's all these like snowflake shaped cities.
Oh, yes. Okay. I know what you're talking about.
So
Yeah.
a lot of those cities that are built on water are star fort. They're bastion fort style cities, and the way it works is you have a golden ratio angle to one of the arcs around a water source, and the water comes in, and usually it was a swamp, but then they create flowing water. And when flowing water happens, it like flowing water stops mosquitoes. It brings in, like oxygenation, aeration.
Right.
It creates a water wheel, and all of a sudden they have like energy. And so a lot of these cities are built around this idea of go to a swamp and reclaim it.
I mean, that makes total sense. To me, like between like ancient Egypt and Venice and Rome and all, like, to me, it's like, it's for that time, it's such a massive undertaking today
Totally.
to do something like that. And we have giant machines that move things, luckily we can pick up, or we have the ability to, move massive amounts of concrete or whatever, and or pillars in general. Like, but these guys are like, they're basic. I can't even wrap my head around how it was done and under what time frame. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I think that's an interesting one too, because like you look at the Bible and it doesn't say anything about the pyramids, and you get to wonder like, well, when were the pyramids there, or what's the history of Africa, right? Because Africa, you've also got this huge Sahara Desert, and the question is like, was that always Sahara Desert? But you look at Randall Carlson's work, and you can see like the Tamanrasset river systems. So Africa had these crazy river systems, and the Sahara was basically lagoons and marshlands, and you could travel really fast from one part of Africa to another, like maybe in a couple days at the most, taking wind and channels for river systems. But we look at feedback loops, and one of the biggest ones I like to exemplify is the Aral Sea. Are you familiar with the Aral Sea in Russia?
no.
I mean, if it's all right, I'll pull up a quick picture of it.
Yeah, of course.
So the Aral Sea was the biggest sea in Russia and Ukraine, right here, right in the Kazan tip area here. And it was so big that they thought, hey, we can just, what we'll do is we're going to just cut off a little bit right here. You know what I mean? We'll separate that. And that way we can keep this water separate, and we'll have this water up here. The problem with that was 1989. This is 2014. You can see the entire Aral Sea, the biggest sea, dried up, completely dried up. This is like Holes, the book with, Camp Green Lake or something like that.
Yeah.
It's just gone. And this is not 1,000 years. It's not 100 years. It's not more than 20 years, right?
Oh, yeah.
So like the idea of feedback loops that move really quickly and can change things, like people don't understand. Africa could very quickly have gone from being a marshland with tons of water. And one of the examples is Yuya, who is the advisor and the economic leader of the pharaoh in the 18th century dynasty before Akhenaten, 2-3 generations. His great nephew being Akhenaten. Yuya was a Semite and a Hyksos, and so often is associated, if you go to the Wikipedia of it, Yuya is associated with Joseph, the Technicolor Dreamcoat Joseph in the Bible. Mm-hmm. And the story of Joseph is that Joseph comes to Egypt, not by choice, and when he gets there, he has to end up running the place, and he tells him, hey, prophecy, dreams coming, there's going to be a famine, a drought, in fact, you should probably get as much grain as you can. The historical record of that time about Yuya is the Hyksos take power, they're slave masters, and they really conquer they have a volcano god, Yahweh. And whenever a volcano destroys a town, they show up and they conquer and they sack it, right? Very much the Joshua and the Big Wall story that comes later after it's sacked, the town that's collapsed. They get to Egypt. Yuya's working for the pharaoh. He's married into the pharaoh. The pharaoh's like a mafia. It's just a family. But as time goes on, they become more powerful because they break one of the most sacred laws of Egypt. There's the Ptah-hotep divine maxims. It's like the 10 Commandments. Actually, 10 Commandments come out of the 42 divine maxims, because of course Moses comes out of Egypt.
Right.
The divine maxims say, do not divert water. It's a major law. Like, because the main thing is the flood season comes, the flood will cause grass to grow, and then people can eat, and their cattle can eat, and they can eat the cattle, they can sell the cattle.
Okay.
By diverting water, that would end the flood season.
Mm-hmm.
During Yuya's period, they divert water towards Giza. And there's a bunch of evidence that's, we've been talking and speculating about this for years, but with LiDAR now they've shown there's another river line that when the Nile was diverted, because water comes from Ethiopia, the snow melts off in the winter in Ethiopia and it floods into Egypt. It's going against the direction it should go. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
They use that water to, attach, hypothetically, papyrus to blocks. They float the blocks through the water. They build a system of blocks that then allow for water to fill, and then they move the block underneath, strap the papyrus to it, it floats up. And then this is how they build the pyramids. This is the papyrus water floating pyramid hypothesis, right?
I've seen this, but I mean, you're talking tons, like floating, like
tons.
Really?
Tons. It's easy to do. They've shown that you can do this. It's not actually that difficult because it's all about buoyancy. Right, so once you have enough papyrus or foam around this thing, and they've done this in scale models, which is something that Adam brought up on his show. So like respect to Adam Krigler and Based AF, because he's like, I don't know, Andreas, it could be true, but he seemed pretty into it too. So to be fair,
see so just a quick pause. Like those are the things that I want to like see. Is like, okay, how did they build the pyramids? Is like, okay, let's recreate the experiment of how this worked. Like. I would love to see all that stuff and seeing like the whole like video of it and like watching someone in modern day do that.
There's a British guy with a YouTube channel called Pyramids Really Built, and he has his own little thing here. He's actually great, and he's done scale models, digital models, engineering models to show how it would done, and presented this theory where you have basically the animal stomach hides, and you have papyrus, and they're wrapped around blocks, and they don't just float the block up out of the water, but they're enough that they float along and can be pushed in the water, displacing enough weight. And by locking them in place, then you create canal systems. This is the same as the Panama Canal. And as time goes on, they can layer more and more brick by brick as the water level rises with the bricks. They can then open the channel door and let more water up, and then they can bring water up to a higher point. They can continue to do this, and eventually they just push the blocks to all their places. This is the entire. There's a ton of videos on this theory, and there's actually a few videos on actually the demonstrative scale process. I don't know where he has it here. I think it's in this one here. He's also showing using scale. If you put something at the base, here's a rock, the base of the pool. And if you put it through the thing, it will float up to the top, right? Like this is the idea. So putting them at the base, and then they come up the tube, right? And this is the same incline as the pyramid to show that it would be. It's all to scale, right?
So is the theory that by diverting the water to build these pyramids, like they essentially
created this huge famine? They destroyed Egypt. Egypt used to be this green, lush place. It was horrible. And then what happened with that is that everyone in Egypt was like, oh my God, I can't get food for my 30 kids. A lot of these people. So they have to say, all right, I'll sell what I have. I can sell everything I have to buy some food. Who's got the food? Well, the Pharaoh, luckily, had this prophecy that there's going to be a drought from Yuya, the guy who diverted the water in the first place. So now all of a sudden they're buying food from the Pharaoh, which makes the Pharaoh very wealthy. But then the Pharaoh's next year, this is 7 years of famine. So the next year they don't have anything else to sell. They're like, all right, well, you just sell us your cattle. Well, we can't sell you our cattle. That's like how we make money. You know what? You keep your cattle. We'll just take a tax. You use your cattle, and we'll just take 10%, and that way you can use it on the. It'll be our cattle that you are taking care of as a serf. Next year, same thing, but we don't have any cattle left. Give us your land. So we'll own the land technically, but you'll be able to farm on your land and you'll pay a tax. And this is literally like the beginning of our indentured serfdom that we have forever after that.
Wow. That's crazy. History is wild, dude. It's It's a crazy thing. And the fact that a lot of it we don't know, or it's, as you said, like sort of kept secret for, one reason or another.
Yeah. It's like lawyers that they're like, we'll speak for you in court. We know what the words mean.
Right. So I was going to ask you, something interesting I listened to yesterday, and I figured, we're about to talk. I think this is something that Andreas probably either knows about or would be interested in. It was a whole video on the tobacco industry. Once they were slapped with a bunch of regulations, they basically just sidestepped to the food industry. They basically bought up like a bunch of big companies, and
Morningstar is a great example. The vegetarian soy food that all your vegetarian vegan friends like to eat, those vegetarian Morningstar sausages, named Morningstar, not unlike Lucifer, actually, right? But that's owned by Philip Morris.
And these, basically, they started experimenting on foods that were
the Simpsons tobacco. The Simpsons tobacco thing is real. A lot of people. We've had a guy on my show. He does the vape, the nicotine vape, and it's nicotine from tomato. So like a lot of the sources that they're getting it from now, right? There's these like pseudosynthetic GMO plants that they can get their chemicals from, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't like to talk bad about the tobacco companies. I feel like sugar companies, tobacco companies, like if you've ever been to Cuba, if you've ever seen like how like that's done, it could be better. It could be cool. And tobacco's not like this evil drug. I don't think that everyone should smoke it. Like the Book of Mormon says, like the word of wisdom, you should probably just put it on wounds. I think that there's something to that. Like nicotine has medicinal qualities. They've used scopolamine for boats if someone has seasickness and things like that. I do know that Truth, if you remember the Truth movement, where they would show up in buses in your town and give you dog tags that said Truth and tell you smoking was bad for you. Truth was run by Philip Morris.
Right. Yeah, I do remember that.
So the idea of making tobacco more expensive through socialism, that it's subsidized by the government and that the government gets a payment, very similar to the lottery system. These are the same people that know exactly how to do the same thing. And I think there's also kind of a scare about nicotine that maybe we should like study more. Like mononicotinamide is really important. Vitamin B17 mononicotinamide is used in certain kinds of health therapies that people were dissuaded against during the quarantine, but were pretty beneficial according to some people, allegedly, including myself.
Well, the problem is like most things, especially, we're talking about nicotine. The issue isn't so much like that it's there. Like there's a lot of stuff that we have that's okay for you and has some good uses. That the issue is how it's engineered. Like they've made it this drug.
Bro, you're going to get me so deep into the CIA. It hurts. I can't even believe you did this to me. Okay. So, the first drug, the Pinkerton, FBI, OSS, Connecticut, white Anglo-Saxon psychopaths, WASPs, CIA timeline. So Pinkertons, starting with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in South America, some of the best drugs for mind control. If you give someone an opium and you take it away from them, sure, you can get them to tell you stuff in order to give them the opium. But there's another drug that's more interesting, and you've probably seen the Vice special on it, the Devil's Breath, where they blow this scopolamine in your face. Yeah. Scopolamine is from the Solanum silica family of nightshades, potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco, eggplant, etc. Bellflower, belladonna. They're very popular. They're very popular with covens, with witches, right? Because there's uppers, stimulants, there's downers, depressants, there's all-arounders and psychedelics. This is none of that. This is a deliriant, right? It's a deliriant. And if you give it to somebody, they might think what's going on makes sense. That's a really weird kind of drug. Because you could be like, this guy's green. Of course. You could tell them this guy is, he needs money for my mom. I'll empty my bank account. No problem, right? And we've heard those stories, and everyone's like, wow, that's crazy. Thank God that's never happened to me. Eat some French fries with ketchup. Yeah. People don't understand that this is not, like, this is continued on. Like, you can look at the Bernaysian psychology of 4 out of 5 doctors recommend this. to smoking is sexy. And that comes right at the same time as ketchup on French fries with cigarettes. This Americana of scopolamine that emerges, and it's not just natural, but it's not unnatural either. Scopolamine is a defense mechanism of the plants, and the plants are saying, "Hey, I don't want you to eat me. I'm not ripe yet. I'm going to have this thing that warns things. And if anyone ever talks to somebody that ate me, they're going to know that they shouldn't have eaten me, right?" And usually that goes away. A scopolamine plant, like a like a green jalapeno, will turn red or black. And when that scopolamine's basically gone, and it's saying, you know what, take my seed, spread me in your poop, right? Very benevolent nightshade. Until it does that, like a purple eggplant, right? Until it does that, it's saying, don't eat me. Like potatoes that are raw, like, and people talk about scopolamine poisoning, that's because the potato's like, dude, I'm not ready. And what they'll do is they'll pick fruit raw, in fact, before it's ripe, so that it can ripen in the truck. So what we've done is we've created this system that we like spray plants to make them the right color, you know, and everything, while spreading as much scopolamine as possible and eating as much scopolamine as possible and ingraining that in our culture. It's ideologically, I like Ike. Yeah, I guess I do, right?
It's scary, dude. Like that's like that's the kind of, that's what I mean. Like you hear it, and on like you and I talking about it, we're like, oh yeah, it makes sense. Like in a contained conversation where we can both think and not be like influenced by everything outside. But again, you try and talk about these things in groups.
Oh yeah, try telling people that they can't eat French fries anymore or something. Yeah, they freak out. Yeah.
Right.
Even the idea of nightshades is so intense because everything has it. You're like, what? I couldn't eat anything anymore. If I were to like be careful about being poisoned or mind controlled, I would literally have to watch out for everything I ate. Yeah, basically. That's kind of if you've been picking up what we're laying down, you should watch what you're putting in your body.
So what, I guess, has it always just been about controlling people and what they do for a dollar? Is that essentially what it comes down to when they realize like, oh, I can just put this stuff in here and I can slowly push people towards what I need them to do. I mean, because obviously history's always had evil people. And once you get those like people who originally are doing it, and then the company starts rolling, like, right, like you just push the thing down the hill, and then before long the company or whatever, it's not even about that messaging anymore. It's just sustaining itself. Like, oh, we just got to keep making this thing and push it out because we need more money to keep funding.
I think it's more like if you were competing with your friend, like again with the longest yard, you're like, my slaves are better than your slaves, and more, my power comes from the power I've accumulated. So it's not good enough to just have slaves, right? Like that, to like chip rock. You want doctors' slaves, lawyer slaves, scientist slaves, engineering slaves. And that's really the sign of power. Like, look how much power I have. I can realize my dreams. That's what a king wants, is like the ability to realize their dreams. So you build that culture around controlling people, teaching them exactly what they need to know in order to not become free, but you also empower them to an extent. And I think it's a big thing that helps the elite sleep at night. The devil has to think they're more righteous than God, right? That's their whole idea. So they're thinking they're helping in the long run too.
Yeah, it's scary. It's scary because you don't know. You truly don't know. Like you know you're being poisoned, but you don't.
I don't know. That. So we talked about this a couple times. I have a guy, Dr. Longo, Old World Florida. I don't know if you've seen his channel, but we did a couple of shows recently on the Knights of the Golden Circle. Have you heard of that group? Right? So they were like in the Civil War, a lot of people were like, oh, they were like this group that were from the South that were trying to take over, and they tried to assassinate Lincoln, but on a bigger scale. They were in the North and the South and in England, and they ended up in Cuba and all over South America, and KFC, PepsiCo. If you've watched that movie, The Kingsman, if you've seen The Kingsman, there's a sequel where they have this lady, this redhead Wendy's-like girl, who's out of this Caribbean banana republic where she runs a KFC, essentially. She's a diner that she's cannibalizing people, right? That's a pretty literal metaphor, because you have this idea of after the war, we're going to control people And you know, I remember going to South America thinking like, when is World War III starting? You know, this is like 2012. I was going down there. I was like, it's so clearly imminent, right? When's it going to start? And I remember thinking to myself as I was in stores and seeing European Argentinians who were like 6 feet tall picking rice off the top shelf that was 7 times more expensive than the arsenic laden rice on the bottom shelf that was for the Bolivians, right? Or the indigenous people, right? Who basically been killed off in Argentina, but even in Bolivia, they can't afford quinoa anymore because they're selling it at a loss. And they're buying pasta from China that's made from wheat grown south of the lithium battery plants. So it's leaching up all the chemicals. And this is something they can't sell in China. So they export it to South America. And in Bolivia, you used to have 30, you know, your grandmother had 30 siblings, brothers and sisters. Your mom had 15. You have 2 and a cat. You know what I mean? Like, cause you're not like, cause this isn't just in Argentina. This isn't just in Los Angeles or in like New York City. This is all over the world. But in places where there are still native cultures, it seems the most clear that there's an evidence to say, okay, you're from here. You're going to get paid the least. We're going to take everything we can from you and sell it it's organic. We'll sell that highest dollar in Los Angeles. And then we're going to make you eat poisoned food and your population will drop. You go to Bolivia now, you have 1 million. Maduro made a deal because La Paz is up in the mountains, and it used to be that you had to go up and down these mountains. They built this gondola system, which made it so like in 15 minutes you could go what used to take a week to climb in the mountains across one part of the mountain to the other. And now the people who used to be the poorest, who used to live at the top there, who had to deal with all that, that's where the Russians and the Chinese are, because they made a deal like to pay for this. So they'd import 1 million Russians and 1 million Chinese people, and then they'd bring with them military equipment. And so Russia and China have given Bolivia, you know, tanks, jets, like all these. So we now have a colonial installation in Bolivia, right? And the Bolivian people, like, what do they? They don't interact with these people because they can't afford to use the gondola that they've installed in their state.
Anyone else really depressed of all this?
Sorry, I didn't mean to black pill.
No, but like
there's a really nice park at the top there if you can afford it. It's like got these like swans.
Well, that's good. Silver lining. No, but like again, all this stuff. It's like, okay, so what's the answer? Because on top of all that, like I read a book a few years ago called "Confessions of an Economic Hitman." So you have like all these
good book, yeah.
You have all these people, these like going, you know, American ex-CIA agents going to these other countries and then basically making them, you know, reliant on the U.S. forever.
Yeah, client states. You make them into a client state where they can't function as a state. And Rhodes started to like do that. But you know, Cecil Rhodes was like, hey, let's take a part of Africa where there's 2 tribes. And like we'll cut one of the tribes in half, so they're on either side of the border, and we'll force the half of this tribe and the other half of that tribe to interact with each other. And we'll make sure, because before it used to be like resource based, right? Here's the deal: a state is the legitimate source of violence. A nation is a migratory group of people. So a nation, the nation of Islam, the nation of Jewish people, they can go anywhere in the world. A state is the legitimate source of violence. So they can say it's a resource economy that can force people to pay taxes. So you get a tax system. If you were to force someone to pay tax, I'm bankrupt. Well, no, the state has the tax. The state has the debt. So the state can demand you pay the debt with a sword. That's what Weber defined a state as. And so in that state, there are nomadic people. If you can stop them from migrating, if you can ruin their capacity to migrate, like fly south for the winter, then you can control them. And this is why all these states are designed this way, because you cannot exist on your own. It used to be an autonomous place with all the resources it needed to thrive. Now it's interlocked in a cappuccino economy where you need resources from another state. And if you don't get them through trade, you have to get it through war.
So all this being said, I mean, like what is the antidote to it? Like if population's on the decline, right? Through all of these things, and we're essentially just subjugating people around the world. We speak from the U.S. perspective, and you know, even other countries doing it to others. Like, what do we do to make it? Like, it's not rational, or it doesn't make sense to go back to subsistence farming. Like, I mean,
the Amish population has doubled since 2000.
Say that one more time.
The Amish population has doubled since 2000. It went from being less than I think like 70 to 100,000 people to it's closer to 500,000 people.
Wow.
You might look at a situation where there was a 7 to 20 people create a new Mennonite Amish community. Each one of the women have 7 to 13 kids. The next generation the grandmother has 130 grandchildren, right?
Yeah.
So the idea that we're being displaced, I agree. The idea that we're being erased, maybe, but I don't think the population is declining. I think it's just that a Tavistock mind, you know what Tavistock is? Tavistock mind control. So in Britain, there's a group called the Tavistock Institute, and it produced a lot of media, including the Beatles, with the purpose of introducing pop culture ideas. If you drink, it's your choice, it's your freedom, it's your privilege. If you're these are the ways that you get your freedom. You didn't have that freedom. This is the freedom you want. It's to own a car. It's to have etc. And also to try drugs, like LSD and everything else like that. Not to say that you shouldn't have access to whatever you want to think and do, but there was certainly a push you can see in media to get the population to drop out, to pacify the population, right? And so you see that today. Like all these kids who are like, well, I shouldn't get married until I'm ready. I shouldn't have kids until we're ready. And like, this is crazy because you'll be 40. It'll be nearly impossible biomechanically.
Right.
And, the idea of you can conquer all things together doesn't occur to someone who hasn't seen it. So the quicker you can break up family, the quicker you can shatter that, the more you can destroy communities. But those communities are easily replaceable, right? And we don't like to talk about it, but it's like Islam. Hey, Islam is like, dude, I'm standing right here. I'm a conservative religion with a patriarchy that has women that stay in the home. Like, I mean, honestly, the Midwest, there's a reason why there's a lot of refugee Muslims brought there, because it's ideologically what they need. The same way that people were conditioned to be union mill workers, they can condition people to fulfill the jobs and then the prerequisites of keeping the Midwest going. And it bothers a lot of people. They're like, oh man, the same thing with France. Everyone's like, why are there so many black people in France? Well, because France isn't this little European country. It's a colonial power that's in Tahiti and in Polynesia. And these people in Africa, and these people are French. Like, they're more French than French people. French people watch Good Burger. You know what I mean? Like, French people are Americanized.
Yep.
So like, if you want to keep your French culture, it's your choice. I don't know if you're Le Pen or you're Macron, but you want to keep your culture. It's all about people who speak French, regardless of what they look like. So I think that's the thing a lot of people might say, but I brought this up the other day too, like the lion in Mombasa. Have you seen Jonathan Jacob Meyer, the Dutch super sperm donor who has 1,000 kids in every country?
No.
Dude. So there's this dude in Holland, and he figured out the system, because there's all these people that were like, I'm a lesbian, I'm traumatized, I can't deal with men, can I just buy some sperm and have a kid? And these were all people that would have died out theoretically, their family lines. He produced children for all of them, at least 1,000 in Holland, a few hundred in Australia that we know about, and it looks like 1,000 in Germany, 1,000 in France. It looks like everywhere. Like, his videos are on YouTube, going to all of these countries, and the Kenya, etc. So in a very short period of time, he's gonna have 10,000, 20,000 kids. How is that any different than what we know Epstein was doing? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, how much more of that's going on with doctors that run sperm banks that we haven't caught? Because of course we know there are tons of doctors who've been caught doing this,
Right.
replacing the sperm with their own. There are certainly circumstances where this has happened, right? So I mean, I don't know. We're moving towards a really weird future, but I don't think it's a future without a population. It's just the same population. It's the same thing we've always had. It's a world of Genghis Khans and concubines.
I almost said that. So what about like people like Elon Musk today? Like,
he's all Mormonizing hard, bro. He's got like 20 kids.
Well, like, is this someone who can save us, or is this someone who, like, is he going to be looked at as like the Thomas Edisons and Nikola Teslas, like people who really, like, we're going to be reading about history?
That is such an interesting way of looking at things. You know what I mean? Like, is this like help, help, help? I'm doing all this stuff. Here comes somebody. Is this somebody who can save us? Because like I think that is the way a lot of people look at the world, right? Like there's how am I what can I do? I probably can't do anything. This guy looks like he has more options than me. And I guess the answer might be like to an extent, maybe like if he really wanted to, which I'm emphasizing the point I don't think he does, like maybe he could do good for you. But I think it's more like, does him benefiting himself benefit me? That's really all it is with most things. And here's a guy who, I'm not saying that from a bad perspective. I don't hate Elon Musk by saying that, but like he's gonna do what benefits him, right? And I don't think, at least what he thinks benefits him. He might be short-sighted and wrong about that sometimes. And I just, I don't think it's right for us to be like, it's so scary to me. Like the options are a democracy where there are no rights because everyone's rights are up to question by a mob, or a benevolent dictatorship, hopefully, where you get a dictatorship, but you have as few people involved in that as possible. Maybe just one monarch. And that monarch, hopefully you can please them. And so therefore they'll be benevolent to you and they'll give you a social contract with better benefits. And that's pretty logical. That's very Hobbesian. You don't have, this joke of a community thinking that they built their own government. But what you have is you have the threat of willing to die on your own sword. Like, I'm going to just fall on my own pitchfork before I serve you anymore. The capacity, this is what Hobbes said, right? John Locke said that there's all kinds of rights you could make up. The right to speech and feeling pretty. I don't really like Locke. Thomas Hobbes said you have the right to attempt to refuse to submit until your death. That is pretty much, as if you think about like rights, like in the real sense of chaos and nature, that's basically the only one I can think of. And that might even be variable, because if you think about it, we could, with Neuralink and with pacifism, very quickly get to a point where that's genetically lost. But that does seem like a human condition, right? The willingness to just die rather than submit.
Wait, so are you a chaotician? Are you Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park? Is that
He is a UCSC professor, so he definitely went to school in my hometown.
Okay. Yeah, I think
chaos is real. I think grace is the knot that ties chaos together. People think of chaos as
that's well put. I like that. Go ahead and sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but go ahead.
Well, people think of chaos as something that that isn't organized, and that's not true. It's just something that it cannot be understood, right? It's like people think of it as like it's like the difference between a secret and a mystery, right? Like a secret is something that we can both understand and keep secret. A mystery is something we could tell everybody and no one would understand necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really cool, man. Like I said, I could probably let you just talk this whole time, and it would be
like
fine.
Your questions though. This is good. We should do this all the time, Shagsworth. And by the way, does everyone love the color scheme again? Like the yellow and black is so nice. It looks good. It's very Tartarian.
It's it's that and the libertarian in me that's like kind of pushing through a little bit.
Did you know that the libertarian flag and the Tartarian flag are connected? Did you know that?
I don't think I know, but I would love to hear about it.
I mean, I could just show you really quickly.
Please.
And you'll be like, oh yeah, I can see it.
Yeah.
All right, here's one of the Tartarian flags.
Okay.
They're really all black and yellow. There's a couple more examples in history books like that. But it used to be the East and the West. So there was supposed to be like the East has the owl and the West has the dragon, right? But the dragon and the snake don't tread on me, kind of a vibe. And black and yellow.
Right.
Black and yellow.
Black and yellow. It was in my head. But you sang it, so it's perfect. No, yeah, dude, I love this. Is for sure the point of this whole show. A lot of times it's just to like vibe out with people and kind of pick their brain on stuff. And watching Bay Staff week after week. Some weeks you're on a roll on there. Some weeks you're not as chatty. But like either way, it's still like. I see like your mind is always working. You're always looking for something, for answers or truth or whatever it is.
Where did you grow up? Are you from Utah? Like, where did you grow up?
No, I grew up in Connecticut, actually.
Oh, okay. So you're a WASP. Cool. I lived in Norwalk for a while. You don't look too waspy. Don't worry. I look more waspy than you.
Thanks.
I lived in Norwalk. Did we talk about that already?
We did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I lived in the northwest corner, so Litchfield
Yeah.
County area. Yep.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting place, man. That's a pretty cool place. But
It
you're in
is.
Utah now, or where are you at now?
Yeah, I'm in Utah now.
Where in Utah are you? Can you say? Or are you afraid? Yeah,
No, I'm okay. I live north of Salt Lake, like around
Okay.
the Ogden area.
Yeah, Ogden for sure. Ogden
Yeah.
is interesting, right? For sure.
Yeah, Utah's an interesting state. Like it with the influx of people from out of state, like we had a lot of people leaving California coming here. It's a
That
beautiful
is a
place.
wild idea. You like bringing all these like short Californians with their white claws into the middle of a Sunday session.
Yeah, it's like it's changed. Even at the amount of time I've been here, I've noticed a huge change. And like, especially Salt Lake is insanely liberal. Like they have
Yeah.
the colleges downtown,
Reactionarily liberal, right?
right? And then kind of where I live, suburbs, and then I deal with a lot of people like out in the valleys, like past the mountains, like the.
Do you feel like the Mormons like? Do you interact with the LDS at all, or are they more isolated now that their state is being invaded, or what do you think?
No, I mean it's weird. Like people, it's almost like very bifurcated because you have people who are just like very staunchly LDS, and that's how they live their lives. And then you have people who are just not that. And like even my wife's family is like they're mainly like Jack Mormon. So like they're going to church, but they're not really like they don't really go to temple or anything. So I don't like we said in DMs, like the people I see and interact with, even though I am very much not LDS, like they're super nice to me. Like the missionaries walk around, or the elders they're called, they walk around the streets and they make sure you have everything you need. And if you need help and
Yeah, just talk to them about like the Heartland model and overshare if you're worried about it, because like if you know a little bit too much about Mormonism, that might freak them out. But no, I mean I
really,
think that the thing with Mormons with LDS, that culturally it's interesting that they're more interested in revisionist history, so they're tapped in. They're more like they have records of it. The BYU professors are like Indiana Jones. They're going to the Heartland. They're going to the Kresge Mounds. They're looking at all the Krigler Mounds, the Hopewell Mounds, all these different mounds, and they're looking at them and they're saying, "Hey, there's obviously a culture here. We accept them as being not just not inferior to us, and not just equal to us, like us. Like the idea that we are them is kind of a existentially interesting way to approach archaeology. You're like, how are we this person? I think that it can, even if it's not completely accurate, right? I'm not saying it is or isn't. I'm just saying even if it's not, that's a better way of approaching something than saying, wow, look how weird this is. So alien,
right?
Can't
No,
understand it.
well, I think the hardest part about like the Book of Mormon and all that is how recent of a text it is. Like and
in a sense, I think there's like a lot. Like, so okay, sorry.
Or not the text, rather, but I guess the religion in general. Joseph Smith, like he's.
So yeah, like so a couple of things. So we maybe mentioned this, but the slavery thing. So in America, the presidential assassination attempt on the very first presidential candidate who was ever assassinated was Joseph Smith. And Joseph Smith ran for president out of Illinois with a top hat.
Really?
15 years before Lincoln did. Right. And he only could do this because after the genocide of the Mormons, a lot of people don't understand how this all works, because we think about Utah and the polygamy and all this stuff. Forget that for a second. Go back to Connecticut. You have New Yorkers. You have the Mateus cult. You have all these different kinds of Christian utopian socialist movements that are establishing themselves. There's this blonde guy who's saying, hey, you know what? And by the way, this is only possible at this point in history in the United States, where people are saying, you're not going to be a servant to God. You know what I mean? Before this point, it was like lords in the feudal period said, you have to convert to my religion. I'm going to force you to bow. And when you do, you're going to die and you're going to go be a servant to God in heaven. Whereas Christ taught there was this jubilee that was going to occur that we should all enact. It wasn't a blood atonement sacrifice. It wasn't the Azazel scapegoat. It was just, we got to stop having slaves. We have to stop having this huge generational debts. We have to have a jubilee at some point. He gets killed for saying it, right? And out of that we have this idea of blood atonement and sacrifice. But Christ was saying you're co-heirs. If you read Corinthians, if you read the Bible, it talks about you're co-heirs with Christ. Christ is a corporation. Jesus isn't Christ. Jesus is in the Christ, and we are part of the Christ. It's a thing we're doing together. And that's not the logic that Christians were teaching in the feudal period. They were killing people and saying, lords, you think you're going to be a lord like me? You're a servant. You think you're going to be a lord? You're crazy. You're going to be serving the Lord. That's what it is. In Christianity, that's not what Jesus taught, right? 20th century, we kind of can look back at that. But in the 19th century, in the 1820s, when Joseph Smith's looking at this, he has access to these different religious books. He's reading the Mennonite, the Amish German Bible, and he's reading like Sanskrit texts. And this is the Masonic hysteria. So you've got lodges with all of these secret works, right? And this information is coming out. It's like, look, if you really read the Bible, it's saying that we're supposed to work together to be like Christ, with Christ, and we're not supposed to use Christ as this blood atonement for our immortality. That's like the satanic inversion of it. So Mormonism is really flies in the face of old world Christianity, but not in the face of Christ. It flies in the face of European colonialism, but not in the face of the temple period, the fall of the temple period.
Right.
The other thing is that it says that there's a guy who comes, like the whole point of the Book of Mormon, a guy in Egypt, Lehi, leaves right before the fall of the temple, like the first temple. So the Jews have the first temple fall, the second temple fall, the fall of Israel, and that's why they have to carry their culture internally. But before that, you have a different belief system. You have the Deuteronomists, like Christ is getting killed because he's upsetting the Sadducee, which are Deuteronomist Jews. And they believe you have to destroy all the figurines. You have to get rid of all the idols. You can't have a form of God, right? Sound familiar? This is like Islam today a lot of the time. And this is where that comes from. And they were destroying not only the symbols, but they were destroying the temples, because you had this nation, this empire, almost this nation, this kingdom of Judea. But Judea had 12 nations. So each one of them had their own temples. But we go into those temples and you find a Hanukkah menorah that is representative of a woman, which is the goddess, the wife of Elohim, El Elyon, right? Because Elohim in Hebrew is plural for Eloi. So we know from the Jewish tradition, this was a pantheon, not a single god. Yahweh is this monolatry cult that they produce. There's a family. It's the wife of God, Asherah. Okay? And they destroy all the statues. They kill all the priests. They destroy all the temples. And they say, if you ever want to forgive yourself, if you ever do an atonement ritual, you come do it in Jerusalem. You come do it in our temple. You come do it in King Josiah's temple with his priests. You pay us to do it. And that's what Jesus didn't like. He's like, dude, I'm not going to you can't just have this old lady have to spend $100 to buy a shekel novelty coin for the token machine. That's ridiculous. I'm going to pull my whip out, right? And so I think that's the thing, is that this tradition shows a pre-Deuteronomist path, and it's actually weirdly historically accurate when you look at it that way, because you're like, well, this is what the Jews actually practiced before the Deuteronomist reforms. And this tradition continues to exist. There's also really interesting examples like the Midewa, the Native Americans, the Ojibwa, the Hopi Native Americans that have really similar traditions to this, and the idea of being visited, having saints, having saints that perform miracles, having secret symbols that are the same symbols on their secret garments, having 3 names, a public name, a family name, a private name for God, right? So there's these really interesting things that connect it with the culture. But I think the biggest one is just the anti-Masonic period. The fact that this guy was running for president, and Joseph Smith said, we're going to, because, they killed the Mormons. Like after they left New York, they went to Missouri, and there was a Missouri extermination order where they genocided the Mormons. So they said, hey, we'll go to Illinois. We'll go to this place called Commerce, with the permission of a young congressman, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln guaranteed them Commerce. So they moved into Commerce. They built a city called Nauvoo. It was larger than Chicago, more successful than Chicago. It was a bigger city, and it was really powerful. And he said, hey, what we'll do is we'll help these other states. We'll get them to buy, with the Senate money, these slaves. We'll free them, and then they'll all be citizens. And then we'll use the tax money that's made from that in order to pay back the debt to all the slave owners, so no one loses the money from it. We'll just transition it. And the Jacksonian Democrats under Polk had him most likely. right? Like, I don't know if you're going to get in trouble for accusing them, but this is my opinion, right? But like, it's pretty clear that Joseph Smith was assassinated in the weirdest way possible because he was taken to another town where they didn't have his court system around him. And then in the night, he was thrown from the window, and there's all of these vendetta gangsters that were put out. And so a lot of people will argue this idea that, I mean, but if you think about it, like, there's no better example because he's the first presidential candidate assassinated, and all he wanted to do was free slaves. 15 years later, the dude who made it possible for him is running for president on his campaign of abolition in a top hat, which just kind of blows my mind, realistically. I don't know.
It was against slaves. I guess you could make the argument that LDS just creates a bunch of slaves. It's
Elaborate. I'm into it.
Well, I mean, I think more so than a lot of, I mean, maybe not more so than a lot of religions, the rigidity of the LDS church is I guess a little insane, but I guess in some respects, like religion, that's what religion does. It says these are our principles, and it outlines very clearly what they do and do not believe, and you go from there.
Yeah, I think rigidity is also like a secular issue because you look at Christianity when it wasn't the state religion and they were hippies living in sewers. So once they become the state religion, they're sacrificing people in gladiator rings. Like something about being in charge will do that. And I think Utah is a great example of that. I also don't know if I would say that like the Utovian Mormonism is like the exact version of Mormonism that Joseph Smith practiced. I'd say read like the King Foley Discourse. And what he's saying is, become a god because you are the breath of God in dirt. So don't just be, a servant, and like shake the hand of spirits. Don't just trust, don't just believe in what the apostasy, like some like person who says they're the operator between God and you connect to. But of course he gets killed, right? And so it's hard to associate even what Joseph Smith was doing with what Mormonism becomes, because Mormonism becomes its own thing in Utah, right?
Yeah, I think after that, it's like Brigham Young takes over as like the prophet, and then on it goes,
right?
Something like that. I remember because I read Under the Banner of Heaven, which was a really wild book.
There's 3 or 4 things that happen. So he gets shot, everyone's shocked. Brigham Young becomes the president, and people say he has the apparition of Joseph Smith, whatever that means. Like they end up going with him, but not everybody does. In fact, Joseph Smith never said that Brigham Young was supposed to be his guy, and he wasn't a member of the Melchizedek priesthood. So he had said Strangite allegedly should have been in charge up until his own son, his one and only son. This is the other thing, because everyone's like, oh, Joseph Smith is polygamist who had tons of wives. There's literally no evidence of that whatsoever. The only evidence we have is made up from the Nauvoo expositor. So there are people that were accusing Joseph Smith at a certain point of this. And a lot of Mormons, like, they're like, fine, whatever, we'll just accept it. Brigham Young was a polygamist for sure. Brigham Young had hundreds of concubines probably. They're fine with that. But when you look at Joseph Smith, you would think that a guy who was a polygamist would have like 15-year-old wives, like, all these kids and all. Not like that. There's one story about Fanny Alger. It seems to be made up. They took the word affair. Underneath it says scrape. They've erased the word scrape and written affair. There's a whole thing with that. That's the only example. The rest of it are like 50-year-old women, including, we talked about the Masonic hysteria. The Masonic hysteria happened because everyone was Masonic in America. And William Morgan, who was going to write an expose on Masonry, disappeared. And when he disappeared, his wife, Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Smith, she married Joseph Smith, which I find pretty interesting, of all the people. Not that she had a kid with him and he was 50. And like this is all, like, all of these stories are that he basically had spiritual weddings with these women that he didn't actually, regardless, we can't pretend that they're anything like the polygamous marriages that occurred in Utah. Like, there's no comparison. And he has one son, and he had another son who died, but his one son, and his son, Joseph Smith III, was supposed to be, he said, in charge of the church when he got to be old enough. They never let that happen. He ends up in charge of the reorganized community of Christ, right? The organized Latter-day Saints, which is where, when people talk about Jack Mormons, they talk about the COC a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. But there was a point when Joseph F. Smith Fielding, but not the same, because there's a Joseph Fielding Smith as well, met his cousin, Joseph Smith III, and they're in a bus together, and they're talking, and it's like, Joseph Smith III is in charge of the community, the Reorganized Church of Christ, and they've allowed black people back in. This was another big thing. Joseph Smith was totally cool with black people, right? Like the abolitionists, he was freeing slaves. There were black members of the church. There were black priests. There's a guy named Kwaku. There's like all these different people. Walker Lewis. He ends up, when he's dead, Brigham Young bans blacks in the priesthood. And this becomes a thing until the 1970s, right?
Yep.
But it's not for the reorganized church. And by the 1860s, they're cool with it. Simultaneously, by the 1890s, there's the manifesto that it forbids polygamy in the Mormon church. All of a sudden, the Mormon church is against polygamy, right? But Joseph Smith III's always been against polygamy and said his father never practiced it and that it's a complete lie and that it was never part of the religion. In fact, there's like verses against it in the Book of Mormon. So now you've got this moment where it could have been, you know, like one guy's church has gotten rid of racism, the other guy's church has gotten rid of polygamy. They could have made it work.
Right.
And then that's where, like, I think the war between churches starts, and it shows you that there's not really as much unity as there needs to be.
Yeah, and this is why these conversations are so great, and why I like talking about things that are fairly controversial at times, is because I don't always I'm not going to believe something wholesale, but you know, when you read books based, you know, talking about Mormon history, like Under the Banner of Heaven, it's a great book, and it details like the past, and then it talks about the two brothers. I can't remember their names. I can't remember names the way you do. Holy shit, dude. But they're actually, one of them's dead, and the other one I believe is still in prison out in the desert. And they basically killed their sister-in-law and niece, like because God told them to. There's a whole show on it on Hulu, and like I said, the book is great, but that history that they tell is very like anti-Mormon and anti-Joseph Smith. So like you hear this part of it, and it makes me want to dig a little bit more and understand like who
Mormons
he was.
They're big about the fruits of your labor. And so like you look at some of these like Utah cults that are tangential of Brigham Young, and they're deeply polygamy based. They seem misogynistic, and they end up being very similar to satanic sex cults that we warn people about.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that's interesting, because Mormons will tell you, like, follow the fruits of your labor. Mormons don't practice polygamy. And so I think it's something they should look into more. The idea that Joseph Smith probably didn't practice polygamy, at least the way that they were taught, and that maybe the whole thing might be superimposed on them, because there's a lot of things superimposed on Mormonism that have nothing to do with the goal of being a free person that's making your own choices in this world and trying to make the world a better place. And I get your idea of like rigidity, but like rigidity is like, this also reminds me of Islam, because Islam means submission. But if you go to Indonesia, like Indonesians might say that Islam means bliss, because all it really means is like being yoga in balance. So you might look at somebody who says, okay, I'm not free to take crack and like suffer or something like that, and say, oh man, that poor guy, all he can do is like build rockets and like make movies. And like, have you ever seen a Mormon, dude? Like, they do crazy things. Like, they go to like Disney World and they play golf, and they have like rec rooms in their houses. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think they're missing out. It's like the rigidity of a canvas. It's like telling, oh man, I'm sorry, Picasso. I'm sorry about the rigidity of your canvas. You're going to have to work with just this white square. I don't know what you're going to do.
No, I see what you're saying. And honestly, I think the more and this is the point of the conversations too, right? Like, okay, I have an idea in my head. You present your side. I can think about it, and it makes total sense to me. And I can either walk that back, or, try and substantiate my claims more, or look into it more. But yeah, I like what you said. I think it makes perfect sense.
There's definitely things to work on, man. I don't think, I think as soon as, like Groucho Marx said, as soon as you're like, I would never join a club that would accept me as a member or something like that. Like, we should be really careful about it. And I think it's cool. We come from this time that's really like hesitant to be part of community. We're like a post-plague culture. This is right after the plagues. A lot of people were afraid and hesitant to join lodges and be part of communities, right?
Yeah.
Distrust in elders. We couldn't rely on old people to teach us how to live in this world. We had to invent our way with computers along the way. So I think we're a reticent culture of having that kind of community.
Yeah.
But it's to me, that's also what's so alluring about it. Like, you look at how essential community can be to making something function, to making you know, all of these people thrive, right?
Yeah.
And so like there is something really beautiful about that there's a desert in like covered in salt that kills everything, and out of that this amazing community thrives, right?
Yep. Yeah, it's wild out here. I like living out here. So the people are great. I have a lot of great family here, my wife's family rather. But I've always been a nomadic kind of soul. Like I like to move around, and I haven't really explored outside of the US. It's something that I would like to do in time. But
People
the
forget
funny,
outside the US how big the US is, though, also.
well, that was going to say, I was like, I really haven't fully explored the United States. Like I've lived in a few states, but I even hear from Europeans a lot that like the US is huge. Like you guys have so many different cultures right here. Like there's no reason for you to travel.
We're bigger
like,
than Europe in a lot of ways. And like Europe is so tight. Like you can get on a train and you can just wake up in another country. Like but because of that, Europe has become more homogenized than the United States.
Right.
And it's crazy how much Europe is a country. Yeah.
Yep. No, it's nuts. Well, listen, man, dude, this has been a great conversation. I'm glad we were able to make times work. Thank you for allowing me to switch days. Cause
no, it was cool. I appreciate it. It was based. I've shown you the Western Sea interior map before, right? You've seen that?
I think so. Yes, you have. Yeah.
This is my big one. Like, hey, okay, Mormons between Utah and Missouri. Okay, you guys win. Like, cause if you randomly came up with the Western Sea interior, like out of a top hat, good for you. You know what I mean? Like, that's pretty accurate. That's all I gotta say.
It's yeah, dude. It's like the whole they always talk about around here, like Lake Bonneville. Like that's like, you know, it's an ancient lake that the Salt Lake Valley was just filled. Like whatever's left of the Great Salt Lake, it was huge. That even at the Natural History Museum, they have a whole like diagram of what it looked like, and you can fill it up, and they'll show you like how long ago it used to look like that. Again, like in this state too, like it has got me really into like geology and wanting to explore like rocks and
dude, crystals, portals. I mean, like I remember going to Burning Man, the idea that there's portals between Pyramid Lake and Tahoe and Washoe Lake. And I remember thinking, like, I don't know, I haven't delved too deep into that, but the idea that you could get from one lake to another through a portal sounds cool.
Oh, hell yeah, dude. Yeah, man, it's a wild, but yeah, man, thank you for joining me. It's been real. I've learned a lot, and I look forward to our future conversations because I don't want this to be our last. This is awesome.
Let's definitely again. And like next week, if you're free, join APM. You guys know I do Based on Monday. I have a synchronicity show on Tuesday, and APM is like synchro, but all over like whatever we talk about. And I think it'd be a fun one. So see you there, bro.
Yeah, and guys, make sure you give him a follow. If you guys aren't already, I assume a lot of you guys know of Andreas, but make sure you're subscribed to him, following him on social media. His links are down below. Do all the things for him, and of course, join me. I'll be not streaming tomorrow night because I'm going to see Rob Zombie tomorroh.
Sweet.
And Alice Cooper.
With Alice Cooper.
Yeah.
Oh,
dude.
we should probably talk off camera. All right.
Oh, for sure, dude. But yeah, guys, thank you so much for hanging out. It's been a lot of fun. I appreciate chat showing up, hitting the likes. Next week, I think we're doing some interviews with some comic book creators, and we're just going to be chilling. Shagcast is back next week, and we're playing more of Forever Skies live on stream as well. It's been an awesome time. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you guys next week.
Peace out.